Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2016, presents INTERPHEX Live.
Our topic is overcoming facility upgrades and their challenges. Since we have, we have Geoff, there you go, Barry, and Dave. Right, Dave, yeah, okay. You can raise your hand every time, it's okay. Right? We are missing John Gilroy, but we'll see. So, let's see. So, I'll start, because everybody's more than capable of answering this question, so we'll start from one end and we'll work down and back and forth, and but, okay, so, facility upgrade, just give us a sense. I mean, so it's old, it's dirty, or I want to make something else, or I want to make potent I mean, where do these upgrade, generally, what is a facility upgrade?
Well, in our business anyway, I think there's two major reasons to upgrade. One is increased capacity. The second is to deal with changes in downstream or a new product, new purification scheme. So the way I look at it and always look at it is it's not about fixing something, it's about designing it right to begin with. So I take a more holistic view to the upgrade situation. If those are the two things I have to deal with, design the capacity and infrastructure early when it's cheap to build. Give yourself some extra, I was saying, as the New Orleans folks say about their beignets, you have to have a little lagniappe. You have to have that extra 13th beignet in your pocket. Secondly, if you know you're going to be a multi-product facility early in the game, or you suspect that you've got small markets, small therapeutic targets, and you're going to change those, do something more extraordinary on the downstream. And modular clean rooms are a way to do this and get it done very quickly and be able to retrofit fast.
So Geoff, let me ask you this, and that, it sounds to me like if you're going to try to do that kind of a blue sky approach, pretty much, I think, is it better to start from the product base? What are you going to be making, how are you going to be making, it sounds to me like the development guy's got to be sitting there too. Or is that not the way it happens?
Predicting the future is slippery business. Yeah, but I'll say, and I understand why one might characterize these projects as kind of musty old facility, but truthfully, in my career, which is longer than I care to admit, I haven't been able to get one of these brand new facilities complete and the paint dry before we're changing it. And that's just the nature of this business. A new final filtration technology comes in, or we decide not to fill bottles, we're going to fill bags, or we need to run a new gas service somewhere where it wasn't anticipated. And part of the challenge to designing a new facility is to build that capability into it. And I think that in some cases it's hard to predict beignets, to Barry's point. It's kind of an unknown. So I would tell you that in the case of the musty old facility, you might be doing upgrades that are driven by expectations from regulatory agencies. But for the most part, the changes that I see are driven by the owner, by the operating company, who wishes to either make changes to their process or introduce a new product.
Mm-hmm. We tend to break it down. In our experience at DME, we see projects that are driven by both opportunistic drivers, new product process, throughput expansion, things of that nature, and risk drivers, cGMP deficiencies, manufacturing deviations, just aging facilities and obsolescence. But what usually happens is there might be one overwhelming driver that triggers the project, but if you're going to do a renovation or an upgrade, you want to take care of several other things at once. So it's never just one thing. There's many stakeholders and many objectives that you're trying to achieve at the same time. The trick is to get your entire team aligned so that they're all on the same page and everybody is pulling in the same direction.
Okay. So why don't we do this? I mean, so obviously one of the things I've always seen was invariably the owner wants to maintain full capacity while you guys are tearing things apart. So how do you manage that one? I mean,
Yeah, it's tricky. Most facilities we work in are multi-product facilities, and they don't want to shut down
Well, of course not. No.
cGMP manufacturing, or they can't afford to do it for an extensive period. So it is always a prerequisite in an operating facility that you've got to minimize the disruption with ongoing cGMP manufacturing. And so what you do, I mean, you plan. You do careful planning and analysis on how your construction is going to go about, and work it in with your production and maintenance schedules. If you have a shutdown, and usually you can time this so that there's a shutdown not just for the construction activities, but you can do things in advance. So even before the design's done, if you know that you're going to be doing a renovation or an upgrade project, you can put isolation valves in critical utilities so that they can be expanded easily without disruption. You can establish barriers to segregate ongoing cGMP operations. And those are the sort of things you need to do to plan ahead so that you can execute the project in an expeditious fashion and still do it without any or mitigate at least the risk to other ongoing operations.
So how do you manage the owner doing that, Jeff? I mean, are these things you tell him or he tells you? Know?
I'm going to build on that, what David is saying. I think in a case similar to what we're describing in the midst of an operating facility, those issues are important enough that they might impact the very scope of the renovation.
It's true.
So in my, I would advocate strongly, and with any client I would advocate, to understand, we understand when we have an operating facility with a GMP mission, how everything moves. We know what the air classes are, the pressures, the flows of people and materials. So I want to do a set of drawings for each stage of that renovation that show how that's altered. How did this get altered? And then understand and approve that each and every step. A set of renovation objectives that requires 6 phases instead of a step back that requires only 4. The 4 may win simply based upon the ongoing risk, the schedule impact. It may not be the entire objective of the original scope, but understanding the intermediate cases. How does the building work in the intermediate? And then how are the transitions made? I'm going from step 2 to step 3. When does that happen? How long does that take? What gets stopped during that period? Maybe it's a partial mini shutdown, but it doesn't take very much when presented with those risks for an owner to get on board. It's their blood, their production. They're very interested in ensuring it.
So Barry, you got to walk these guys through this stuff.
What's that?
Somebody's got to. I mean, you got to walk them through it. What Jeff says.
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the techniques that we use is we have a very powerful modeling system. So it's called Destiny Profiler. We're able to really put a 3D model together tied to cost with a parametric database. So we run the owner through a bunch of what-if scenarios in the beginning. So when it comes to what I call, people call it value engineering, I would rather say it's do the invaluable engineering as soon as possible, and that is give yourself the chance to go through these change scenarios and show the owner that for minimum CapEx, doing some of the things that both these gentlemen suggested is worth all the money in the world if you expect to have some flexibility in the future.
And I think, as a consultant myself, again on the process side, but one of the things I'm always trying to, one thing now that we've said all of that, so it gets back to us. So how do you develop the scope and include all of this and get that out to so how do you manage, the scope of a facility upgrade? Now, obviously, right, because otherwise the thing's going to start creeping all over the lot before we put anything together. So
yeah, that's a real challenge, particularly in an upgrade project, because and I would say that's probably the single biggest issue that we struggle with as an engineering services provider at the onset of a project. We've got to have hard and well-defined scope definition in order to execute the project acceptably and to make sure that we're going to meet all the owner's requirements and needs throughout the project. So getting everybody on board with that, that's obviously a multidisciplinary exercise. It's something where you've got to have management buy-in, and you have to have a realistic budget and schedule to match the scope. And so where we see problems and challenges with projects is where either the scope is very poorly defined, or the budget and schedule is not matching what the owner truly wants to achieve within that facility. How do you develop that scope? It's oftentimes it's through it can be through a formal risk assessment or a formal evaluation. It really depends on what the driver is for the project. Where it gets sticky is when you have a legacy facility and you have existing process systems, existing utilities, and you don't necessarily have good data on the utilization and of all the critical utilities, or on what you're currently doing. You need to understand those things, and you need to do some front-end engineering and studies to develop that scope oftentimes before you can really launch into the project.
Jeff?
So, I'm going to kind of own the responsibility. I think we consultants in the early stages of design are, in my view, obligated to illustrate this to the clients in a way that's clear, in a way that's very straightforward. Yeah, as long as I'm changing the spark plugs, I'll just rebuild this engine from the bottom up. In the legacy facility, there's a temptation to do that. I'll just make everything shiny and new, and I'll be out of business before I can get it done. So understanding the full impact and the full set of risks in some of the documents we've talked about, or some of the studies that Dave's mentioning, I think falls to us. It's not in the heart of the operating organization to analyze those things. It's in our bailiwick, in our wheelhouse.
So facility, I think sometimes people I think that's a facility upgrade, and how does I want to add something to that facility upgrade only makes that much more complicated. Am I right? Okay. So you see what I'm saying? So Barry, where we at? What do you think on this?
These changes aren't come by overnight. So earlier in the game, when you're developing these processes, you're developing your QBD strategy and all of these things. At the same time, you should be looking at the facilities development, automation, information management, all that during the standard QBD, and not get to the end of your QBD process and so, oh good, now I have to build a facility. So it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So early engagement at least gives you the chance to vet multiple solutions and have a chance to really think through the engineering that changes you're going to have to make and get prepared for them. Because should have a year or so at least to think something like this through. So it's the communication between PD, product development and process development, and the outside engineering firm or your inside engineering firm.
Yeah. So Barry, let me ask you this then. So renovation versus, I've been involved with several projects where it was going to be, okay, you know what? That's life. We're going to let that life continue, but we're going to take and build this so that when this is a reality, this will go away. So, but that's beyond renovation. So renovation's worth it. Sounds to me like in that case, we almost went greenfield.
That may be the right decision. There's no doubt about it. But you can, if you start thinking about this earlier, you can look at the CapEx and OpEx issues that are going to come up by, again, modeling these systems out and doing the design work. It's, trouble is we value engineer everything all the time. I mean, so we make facilities usually as lean as we possibly can. When was the last time you got to build a bigger mezzanine to put your air handlers in. Oh, we can make it smaller. Well, it's not helpful if you think you're going to have a flexible manufacturing platform.
No, as a user, I can tell you that don't always work, myself. But so where I'm saying, I mean, to the point where, like, there's almost an interim. You almost have to suggest to the owner an interim solution to get to where he wants to be. I mean, so how do you do that? How do you bring that to fruition? I mean, that's got to take. That's what I'm saying. They have to have the right players at the table, Geoff. I mean, if the guy who owns the process, and when I own the process, I mean the guy who developed the process, you got to be asking him as many questions as the guy who owns the plant. So you can actually come up with this. Okay, future's a slippery slope. Got it. But I mean, there are facts.
Yeah.
There is institutional knowledge. How are you going to tap into that?
I think the thing we collectively do to ourselves that's most deleterious to a better outcome is we rush to judgment. And so I'd like to have multiple iterations. I'd like to have multiple options. I'd like to be able to compare them. And one end of the spectrum, maybe it's go off on the lawn and build a new plant and tear the old one down. And it wouldn't be the first time I've ever heard of that decision is made. On the other hand, it may make some sense to do a renovation that covers a certain scope of improvement, but not to the nth degree. But without some structured time to develop those alterations, those options, and to look at them. But to your point, it's very much so that you have to get the people in the room, and sometimes our mission in part is to get them to talk to each other. Not just to listen and to ask questions, but sometimes they haven't heard one another speak either.
Yeah, I've actually seen it where it gets to the point where it's almost, I'd want to say embarrassing, but it's more ridiculous at that stage of the game. Right down to how am I supposed to turn this thing around in here? I mean, we shouldn't be having that type of a conversation. That's where I'm at. We got to say where's the process coming from? Whose is it? I mean, that's just from my end. Because there's stuff I may know that derails everything. Oh, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you guys have been down that road, right? Oh, by the way, it was 20% relative humidity. Nobody told you that? Gee, that's too bad, right?
And the
So what do you
part
think?
it's incumbent on the consultant and the engineering and architectural supplier to ask the right questions.
I agree.
Too.
Yeah.
And that's really part of the value that they bring. It's as Geoff said, it's bringing together the people in a way that they can have a dialogue that's meaningful and constructive and builds that facility program in a way that's useful, and perhaps couldn't happen with the absence of the consultant, and then developing it from there so that the process is well understood and communicated to the consultant that's going to be doing the engineering and construction suppliers and everybody else that's working on the project.
But how do you triage that? I mean, how long does it, when are they giving you what you need?
Well, I hate to keep beating this horse, but starting early to model these things and look at the impact of your process development. The guy in the lab wants to get the peak to come out really nice out of his gel filtration column. He really doesn't give a damn how many stainless steel vessels of buffer is going to be required or all the infrastructure to do that. But the computer time is really cheap to look ahead. Even if you're 100% wrong when you start out, you build a model and you make smarter decisions as you go along. In the case of a retrofit, you still have that ability to look at that based against what the facility is that you have. And then, to your point, you make the decision, renovate or go greenfield.
Well, let me turn it around, Geoff. Let me just say, so how is the design of the process then affected by the renovation requirements? It sounds to me like we can look at it from two different ways.
It's not linear.
Right, there you go.
It's interactive and iterative. So every time I walk down a path, we're all too old in this room to play video games. But if you walk down the wrong tunnel, you just go reset. You try it again, and you try the other tunnel. See if you don't get killed this time. And the early design process is a little bit like that. You have to be satisfied with what we have learned as a team by going down a particular path, and then look at another path, and then look at another path.
So how do you prioritize these elements when you're doing a facility design? I mean, what do you... Did I ask the right question? I mean, to me, this is, client gives it, so how do you, what thought process do you put into the facility design? So where do you start?
Well, we always start with process.
Okay.
The manufacturing process has to drive this development of the facility, and so the first step is to understand, be able to map out what the process is, put together a good narrative and block flow diagram, and an understanding not only of the unit operations, but how material is going to move through the facility, how the owner is intending to operate, and once that understanding is shared by the design team, both owner and consultants, then you can start having fun with the iterative part that you were talking about, because you begin to imagine other ways of operating and other ways of solving problems and sorting through some of the difficulties and obstacles that you encounter in the process, so that you can achieve all those process directives that you started out with. So I agree very much. It is an iterative process, but you have to start somewhere, and sometimes the hardest part is just getting started.
I got you.
So it's it's asking those penetrating questions, investigating, starting with the process, but then also there's a component of this that is investigative with regard to the legacy facility, which we haven't talked about, and that means that there's got to be some survey work done, some discovery of existing documentation. Oftentimes that documentation is incomplete, or you're working in a building that wasn't originally built for that purpose, wasn't originally owned by the owner. And so you've got to plan for unknowns, because you don't know precisely what's behind the wall or under the slab.
Having said that, so why don't we go over what's the challenges between, gee whiz, I got this thing, I want to renovate it, or I want new construction. So, we got to, what do you think, Geoff? I mean, how do we walk them through that?
Yeah, well, let me just say to
Yeah.
David's remark before I do that, I advocate for selective demolition to see what's behind that wall, because
There you go.
some of the issues here that will come into play is limiting risk. You have an operating GMP facility. I don't really want to get a construction crew in an area I've isolated and take something down and find something I was completely unaware of. It pays to spend some time in the plant, cutting holes in things and looking and surveying, and make sure that doesn't happen, even if that in and of itself is disruptive.
Well, based on the question, I mean, that itself, that seems to add a considerable amount to a renovation project as opposed to...
In terms of time,
Yeah.
no question about it.
Yeah, but it sounds to me like it's in both parties' best interest. No question about that.
There's no question. Oh, you only have to get bitten once or twice to
Yeah.
not want to go through that again.
Exactly. I got to...
The difficulty is you don't always have the luxury of being able to access those areas to do that.
Yeah, well, I kind of found that out the hard way myself. Just to let you know, I worked for a small soft gel company in Newark, New Jersey, right out of college, and they were built in the middle of the ironbound section. So virgin ground there was something that had gone away 100 years ago. I was, we were working on a new process. I was stunned at the amount of stuff that was already in place that nobody even knew about.
Right.
So to answer you, I mean, to the point where it was almost like ridiculous. Every time you turned around, it was another thing. So anyway, so we digress. Renovation versus new construction. I mean, isn't it incumbent upon us to kind of guide them in some way? I mean, what do you think? Barry, you want to address, Geoff?
No, absolutely. You have to address it almost as a cultural issue in these companies. If they understand that they've got to invest early to understand what their options are, understand their process development and integrate that into a CapEx model, it really pays out a lot because people know what's coming and they can predict it. In biotechnology, one of the biggest problems we have is that you get to a point where you've got to make something or you've got to build a facility and management has no idea what this thing's going to cost. And all of a sudden they go, it's $150 million. Well, if you made those decisions as you go on culturally, you can predict what those costs are going to be and they can get ready to fund that and look at it in the business model. It's the same with doing something retrospectively. If you really have a great design background and you put the money into those kinds of models and records and design blocks, you can go back and very readily see if it makes any sense to build or not build, or renovate or not renovate.
I find often that the condition of the legacy facility enters into this discussion as well.
Oh yeah.
So you can't do this decision of whether to renovate or go greenfield without understanding, at least at a high level, what it is that needs to change. So some engineering and architectural assessment needs to be done at the front end to develop that scope to a level where you understand what kind of investment, what kind of disruption you're going to encounter by undertaking a facility upgrade before you get into it. And in many cases, we've seen some really ugly facilities, no interstitial space or space that has so much abandoned in place piping and ductwork that you can't sort out anything, the condition of the utilities and support systems are in such bad condition that it really makes sense to just gut it all and start from scratch. But in many cases, I think the value of doing that study up front is that you can say, well, wait a minute, you don't have to rip it all out. You can salvage, deciding what's salvageable can really preserve quite a bit of the equity and investment that the owner already has. And that's really the trick with these kinds of upgrade projects is identifying what is it that has intrinsic value, that is workable, that will produce a quality product and meet cGMP standards consistently going forward, and what has to go. And how do you integrate those two things and still preserve existing manufacturing operations, existing facility flows and traffic patterns that need to be intact for manufacturing.
Yep.
At the end of the day, I don't think any two companies make these decisions the same way. And I don't think they're going to react to the same set of input data in the same way. Some companies are fixated upon retaining existing facilities and making them continue to produce, and they feel that it is overreacting to build new. But on the bottom line, for the four of us that are sitting up here, we're called upon to be neutral, in my view. Just the facts, ma'am. Mm-hmm. And the company will make up their mind. We need to show and illustrate clearly what the advantages and disadvantages are. The new construction will take a long time. It takes more land. It probably takes more money. You do get the ideal solution at the end. What's that worth? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, we have no dog in this fight. If they want to renovate the legacy facility, that's what we're going to do.
So let me ask you this, Barry. I mean, bottom line is we've heard a lot about single-use technology and especially obviously in bioprocessing, but more, and they would talk about continuous use. I mean, your experience, does that come into play here when it comes down to what you're going to design, or if it's legacy or what?
Absolutely. And in most cases, if you're at small scale processing, especially upstream, single use makes a lot of sense and can be more easily retrofit than buying new reactors and large scale reactors, stainless steel reactors and so forth. And you can, again, this predictability thing. I mean, we did a facility recently where we showed the owner originally that by adding 7% to his CapEx, he could double his production if he wanted to. So his decision in the beginning was, gee, if I put this extra space in and I put the utilities in and so forth and so on, for 7% of the CapEx, I've got a chance to double my production capacity by just adding equipment. You know, so those models can be developed again, and smart decisions can get made. But,
And we always, and I say this because I've seen it, but I mean, are we always, we're not, is the owner going to be able to bring that to the party? In other words, can he, you know, is he going to have enough vision to see that one coming? In other words, we say that, it makes sense to us, but if he's sitting there and I wasn't pointing at anybody in particular, but if we're sitting there and he doesn't bring it up,
well, we
got it. Go ahead.
Like was just said, you do have to lead them in the paths of righteousness sometimes. You know, I mean,
wake up.
It's hard because it's paralytic for some companies. You know, we've got a client now who just can't make up his mind to pull the trigger. He's got the market, he's got people asking for the products, he's got a make or renovate situation. In his case, he needs to build greenfield, but he's just absolutely paralytic to make this decision. So sometimes you have to be as gentle as you can, but you've got to also put your foot down and say, look, dude, you gotta do it. You got to do something.
Yeah, I find it's incumbent on the consultant to make the choices as clear as possible to the owner of when they're delaying a decision.
Mm-hmm.
You can lay out the options, the assumptions to move forward. If they're not willing to pull the trigger, they've got to know and understand the consequences to that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to address what you said earlier about single use, because we've had a number of projects where we've taken legacy facilities and the owner wants to introduce a predominantly single-use solution into a facility that wasn't designed for that. Typically, the utilities aren't an issue because a lot of that infrastructure is designed for stainless steel systems. You don't have the heavy CIP, SIP to deal with, but you do have much heavier utilization of hallways, airlocks, movement of materials, oftentimes some very large totes that have to corner and are and because they're not necessarily anchored to the ground, it's mobile equipment. Now you've got to look at the structural loading if it's on a second or third floor and how that will support a mobile process. Also things like waste and just staging areas for removing all the wrapping materials and disposing of all that. So there's quite a bit to a single-use story that is very different from manufacturing in a stainless world.
Mm-hmm.
And while it may seem simple when you first look at it, until you dive down and actually look at how the process is going to operate, you may not realize how significant the impact is on your facility.
Yeah, that was the reason for the gee whiz, I can't even turn that thing around in here.
That's right. Yeah.
That's
you
an
can't go through
embarrassing
the door.
situation to be in, you know. But fortunately, I mean, in that case, it was like, didn't anybody give you the heads up, you know? I mean, but let's talk. The symptomology, you know, analysis paralysis is something that I've seen way too many times. But how do you get them off dead center there, Geoff? I mean, what do you do? You come in, you know, scare them? I mean, what do we do?
Well, you know, at the end of the day, it's their decision.
Absolutely, but I mean...
And one of the options is to not decide.
It's not...
To not decide.
Yeah.
And we're sort of helpless, I think. After we've done our duty to illustrate what the options are in front of them and the pros and cons, or benefits and costs, if a client can't decide, they can't decide. And the opportunity may be lost as a result.
I mean, Barry, all the clocks are ticking for them. He's got market, he's got regular. That ain't gonna always be there. You know, you got to move along. But you know, it's not for us to point that out. But I think sometimes.
Right. And if they do paralyze and get paralytic, you're going to get that phone call 8 weeks from now and say, now can you come back? And
Yeah.
yeah, we'll be happy to do that.
Now it's an emergency.
Now it's an emergency, and
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
costs go way up
I was
because
gonna
now
say,
everything's going to be.
now our emergency rates kick in. You know?
Right, but that's again showing them that predictability of cost very early on, so that this doesn't become traumatic. It becomes evolutionary as you develop the process.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma for the consultant, Russ, because if I have a team that's rolling on a design process and suddenly that's disrupted,
Right.
I have subject matter experts that are going to have to go on other projects. I have discipline leads that
They're going
now
away.
have to go away, and it's very difficult to preserve that team and that momentum that you developed with the owner when that happens.
That's it.
So I find paralysis. I think in 9 times out of 10, if you clearly explain the consequences of inaction and suggest, sometimes persuasively, a path forward that is perhaps the best compromise, mitigates the risks for them. In most cases, the owner will move forward with it, and they recognize that it's in their best interest that you're pushing in this direction, because we don't want the projects to drag on either.
With that, thank you very much.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2016, presents INTERPHEX Live.